40,000 years ago, not millions, not billions, but 40,000, a number so geologically recent it barely registers as a whisper against the full sweep of Earth's autobiography, two kinds of human mind looked out across the same European landscape, the same birch forests, bare in the cold, the same rivers locked at the edges with new ice, the same stars burning above, indifferent to everything below. 40,000 years. If you compress the entire history of complex animal life on this planet into a single calendar year, 40,000 years ago would fall at approximately 11:59 and 58 seconds on the night of December 31st. We are talking about something that happened in geological terms moments ago. The landscape would have been recognizable, though strange in its details. Imagine standing at the edge of what is now southern France, in the shadow of hills that are still there today, still holding the same curve, still catching the same afternoon light in late autumn. The forest around you is dense with pine and spruce. The air carries a cold that has weight to it, the weight of a glacial climate still gripping the continent, still deciding whether to retreat or advance. A river runs below you, broad and gray-green, and somewhere along its banks, on both sides, two different kinds of creature are doing the same things: eating, sleeping, making tools, burying their dead, perhaps dreaming. You can smell the smoke from two separate fires. Here is the fact that should stop you entirely. For a period of perhaps 10,000 years, a span of time longer than all of recorded human history, Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens shared this continent. They were not phantoms or legends. They were real. They were numerous, and at least some of them, on some occasions, looked at one another across whatever distance separated their fires and did not turn away. We know this because their genes are still here. Between 1 and 4% of the DNA carried by every non-African person alive today came from a Neanderthal. The meeting happened. The question this film asks is, what if it had continued? Before we go any further, if you find yourself genuinely moved by what you encounter here, by a depth of these stories, by the strange ache of imagining worlds that almost were, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to AETERNA. Not because it helps an algorithm, though it does, but because it tells me the journey is worth continuing. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you are right now in the world, in the night. These stories travel in ways I will never fully know, and it means everything to hear how far. Now, let us go back. Let us stand at the edge of that forest and ask the question that changes everything. What if they had survived? To understand what might have been, we must first understand what was. And what was, who was, the Neanderthal, is a question science has been revising with increasing urgency and humility for the better part of 2 centuries. The first Neanderthal fossils recognized as such were recovered in 1856 from a limestone cave in the Neander Valley of Germany. The word Neanderthal means simply Neander's Valley, and the valley was named for a 17th century pastor and hymn writer named Joachim Neander, who liked to walk there. The bones that bore his valley's name were immediately controversial. They were clearly human in many ways, and yet not. The skull was thick, the brow ridge-heavy, The brain cavity, enormous. In fact, larger on average than our own. For the next 150 years, science would oscillate between imagining the Neanderthal as a shuffling, dim-witted brute and recognizing, slowly and with something like embarrassment, that it had been profoundly wrong. They appear in the fossil record approximately 400,000 years ago, though their lineage diverges from our own perhaps twice that far back, somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 years ago. They were a European and Western Asian species shaped by the ice. Over hundreds of thousands of years, their bodies adapted to cold in ways that are readable in their bones. Shorter limbs relative to the torso, which reduces surface area and preserves heat. Wider nostrils, which some researchers believe may have allowed them to warm cold air before it reached the lungs. A barrel chest that accommodated the enormous lung capacity needed for a heavily muscled body in a cold climate environment. They were, in the truest sense of the word, built for the world they lived in. They made fire. This is not in dispute. They made tools, specific and deliberate tools, a technology called the Mosterian industry that was in use for over 200,000 years and produced flakes, scrapers, and points of real elegance. They buried their dead. The cave of Shanidar, in what is now Iraq, yielded the remains of at least 10 Neanderthals, and one of them, the individual paleoanthropologists call Shanidar 4, was found surrounded by dense concentrations of pollen from 8 different flowering plants. The interpretation has been debated for decades. Was this a deliberate flower burial, or were the flowers carried in by burrowing rodents, or blown in by wind? We do not know with certainty. But the question itself is remarkable. We are asking whether Neanderthals placed flowers on their dead. That is not the question we were asking in 1856. They cared for their injured. Shanidar 1, an individual who lived approximately 45,000 years ago and died somewhere between 35 and 50 years of age, ancient by the standards of that world, had survived a crushing blow to the left side of his skull that likely rendered him blind in one eye. His right arm had been amputated or withered, either from injury or birth defect, to the point of being functionally useless. He had severe arthritis. One of his feet showed signs of a healed injury, and yet he had lived for years, perhaps decades, in this condition. He had been fed. He had been protected. Someone had looked at this broken, battered individual and decided, deliberately, that his life had value. The calculus of care is not a modern invention. It is older than we are. They were not mute. The Neanderthal hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped structure in the throat that anchors the tongue and is essential to complex speech, is virtually identical to ours. The FOXP2 gene, which in modern humans is associated with the neural fine motor control required for speech, has been recovered from Neanderthal DNA and is the same variant as our own. None of this proves they spoke as we speak, but it makes the possibility that they communicated in complex, patterned, meaningful vocalizations, language, or something very close to it. A serious scientific hypothesis rather than a romantic fantasy. What they said to one another in the firelight, in the cave, in the long dark of the European winter is something we will never know. But that they said things, that seems increasingly likely. In the world as it actually unfolded, the Neanderthals disappear from the fossil record between 42,000 and 39,000 years ago. The timing is not a coincidence. Modern Homo sapiens had been spreading out of Africa in waves, and the great wave of the Upper Paleolithic, the wave that brought the tools of the Aurignacian culture, the first unambiguous cave paintings, the first undeniable evidence of symbolic thought in the archaeological record, washed into Europe at almost exactly the same time. What happened at the intersection of these two migrations is one of the most hotly contested questions in all of paleoanthropology. And we should be honest about the fact that we do not have a clean answer. The extinction hypotheses are numerous. Climate change, the warm interstadial period that accompanied the arrival of modern humans, may have disrupted the cold-adapted ecosystems on which Neanderthals depended. Disease. Modern humans arriving from Africa may have carried pathogens to which Neanderthals had no immunity, a dynamic with haunting echoes in the history of more recent colonial encounters. Competition, with modern humans occupying the same ecological niches, hunting the same animals, sheltering in the same cave systems, Neanderthals may simply have been outcompeted, not through violence, but through the quiet arithmetic of slightly higher birth rates, slightly lower infant mortality, slightly more efficient resource extraction. Assimilation. They may not so much have disappeared as dissolved, their populations absorbed into the expanding modern human gene pool through millennia of intermittent interbreeding. The truth is probably some combination of all of these, varying by region and time. In some places, Neanderthal communities may have collapsed suddenly under the weight of epidemic disease or a particularly brutal cold snap. In others, they may have persisted for generations alongside modern humans, trading, mating, exchanging ideas and tools and perhaps words, slowly diluting into the broader population until there were no longer enough of them to sustain a community. The last Neanderthals may not have died in dramatic confrontation. They may have simply aged without enough children to replace them in a world that was already filling up with something new. But in our thought experiment, in the world where they survive, the critical moment comes somewhere around 40,000 years ago, in the cold heart of the last glacial maximum. The modern human wave has arrived. The competition is real. The disease pressure is real. But in this alternate timeline, the balance shifts slightly. Perhaps a particularly severe winter devastates the modern human populations in Central Europe, buying the Neanderthals time. Perhaps an unusually productive decade of megafauna hunting, mammoths, woolly rhino, giant deer, allows several Neanderthal communities to grow large enough to be demographically stable. Perhaps the interbreeding goes further than it did in our world, and the hybrid children who carry both lineages' advantages thrive in numbers that prevent either population from disappearing entirely. The mechanism need not be miraculous. Evolution does not require miracles. It requires only a marginal shift in the balance of ordinary pressures. So let us say they survive. Let us say that by 35,000 years ago, there are still identifiable Neanderthal communities in what is now Iberia, in the Balkans, in isolated valleys of the Caucasus. Their numbers are reduced, They are no longer the dominant hominid of Europe, but they are there. They are watching, and the world that unfolds from that premise is stranger and more consequential than almost anything else one could imagine. The first thing to understand about coexistence is that it is not peace. It is not war either. It is something more complicated and more human. It is negotiation, conducted in the oldest possible language, which is not language at all, but the language of proximity and resource, and the daily decisions made by creatures with enough intelligence to plan and enough hunger to compete. The story of two hominid species sharing a landscape is not a story about harmony. It is a story about the slow, grinding, improvisational work of living next to something that is like you, but not you, and finding out what that means. In the early period, the first several thousand years after our divergence point, in the range of 35 to 25,000 years ago, the coexistence would have been largely territorial. Neanderthals and modern humans had, in our actual history, already demonstrated an ability to occupy the same landscapes without constant warfare. The archaeological record shows sites where both cultures' tools are found in the same stratigraphic layers, in the same caves, suggesting sequential or perhaps even simultaneous occupation. In our alternate timeline, with the Neanderthal population stabilized but reduced, this overlapping territory becomes the central fact of life for both groups. The Neanderthal advantage lies in deep local knowledge. They have been in Europe for 400,000 years. They know the land the way only vast generational memory can know it. Which springs are reliable in the worst droughts, which passes through the mountains hold snow until June, which valleys shelter aurochs herds in the coldest winters. Modern humans arriving from the south and east are brilliant adapters, but they are new to this particular landscape. The transfer of ecological knowledge, whether through direct communication, through observation, or through the genetic inheritance of hybrid children, is one of the most important transactions of this period, and it flows, initially, in one direction. The modern human advantage lies in something harder to quantify, but visible in the archaeological record of our actual timeline, a kind of cognitive flexibility, a capacity for cumulative cultural innovation that seems to have allowed modern human technology to ratchet upward in complexity in ways that Neanderthal technology did not. The Mousterian tool tradition was stable for 200,000 years. The Aurignacian and the cultures that followed it in our world changed within millennia. This is not evidence that Neanderthals were less intelligent. It may simply reflect differences in social structure, in the size and connectivity of groups, in the degree to which knowledge was shared across individuals and accumulated across generations. A small, isolated community, however brilliant its members, innovates more slowly than a large, well-connected network. In our alternate timeline, the pressures of competition may actually accelerate Neanderthal innovation in ways that their relative isolation had previously prevented. And then there is the matter of children. We know because the DNA of living humans carries the evidence that interbreeding occurred. In our alternate timeline, with Neanderthal populations persisting in proximity to modern human groups for not 10,000 years, but 50,000, 100,000, the amount of genetic exchange is dramatically larger. The hybrid individuals born of these unions are not in most cases walking advertisements for cross-cultural romance. They are the ordinary, unremarkable children of parents who lived in proximity and found each other across whatever barriers of habit and custom separated them. Some of these children may have been raised by Neanderthal communities, some by modern human groups, some perhaps by mixed communities that slowly develop their own distinct identity, neither one nor the other carrying the best and the worst of both lineages in their blood and their habits and their ways of meeting the world. This is the central engine of the alternate history, not coexistence as a political fact, but hybridization as a biological and cultural reality. The two populations do not remain separate. They cannot. They are too similar in their needs, too overlapping in their territories, too biologically compatible for separation to hold indefinitely. What emerges over thousands of years is not the triumph of one kind of mind over another. It is something more interesting and more ambiguous. A new kind of human, shaped by both lineages, carrying the memory of both fires. To understand what a world with persistent Neanderthal populations might look like cognitively, what a partially Neanderthal humanity might think differently, perceive differently, value differently, we need to be honest about the limits of what we can infer. Cognition does not fossilize cleanly. We can measure brain volume, but brain volume and intelligence are related in ways that are still poorly understood even in living humans. We can look at the archaeological record for evidence of symbolic behavior, art, ritual, trade, the external residue of internal mental life, but the relationship between behavior and cognition is not simple or direct. What we can say is this: Neanderthal brains were, on average, slightly larger than modern human brains. They were also differently shaped, more elongated, with a relatively smaller prefrontal cortex and relatively larger occipital regions associated with visual processing. What this means behaviorally is genuinely uncertain, but some researchers have proposed that Neanderthals may have been extraordinarily good at certain kinds of visual spatial processing, tracking movement, reading landscape, processing the three-dimensional information of a hunt in real time, while perhaps being somewhat less efficient than modern humans at the specific kind of abstract, language-mediated, generative cognition that underlies long-range planning, extended narrative, and the complex social coordination of large groups. If this interpretation is correct, and it is contested and should be held lightly, then a hybrid humanity carrying both cognitive architectures might have been, in certain measurable ways, more capable than either lineage alone. The Neanderthals' deep ecological intelligence, its extraordinary physical memory of landscape and animal behavior, its visual acuity and spatial reasoning, combined with the modern human's facility for abstract language, long-range planning, and the maintenance of large, complex social networks. This is a combination that sounds, in retrospect, like an engineering brief for a particularly well-adapted apex intelligence. The evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior has been accumulating with increasing force over the past 2 decades, and it keeps pushing the dates back. Eagle talons found at Neanderthal sites in Croatia and Spain, carefully perforated for suspension, suggest jewelry or personal ornamentation. Pigments, ochre and manganese dioxide, found at Neanderthal sites across Europe, predate the arrival of modern humans and suggest a practice of body painting or material decoration. The cave of La Pasiega in Spain contains geometric symbols, ladder shapes, lines, dots, that have been dated using uranium-thorium methods to at least 65,000 years ago, well before modern humans arrived in Europe. If these dates hold, and they have been challenged, and the debate continues, then Neanderthals were making abstract marks on cave walls for reasons that we cannot fully explain, which is to say, for reasons that sound like art. In our alternate timeline, this symbolic capacity does not wither and die. It is carried forward, integrated with the modern human tradition of representational art and narrative symbol making, and the result is a visual and symbolic culture of extraordinary richness. The cave paintings of our actual Upper Paleolithic, the Lascaux bison, the Chauvet lions, the horses of Altamira, are among the most astonishing aesthetic achievements in the history of our species. Imagine them enriched by a tradition that had been running for tens of thousands of years longer, integrated with a Neanderthal visual intelligence that may have processed the natural world with a resolution and immediacy that modern human cognition approached only in its most gifted practitioners. The art of this hybrid world does not look like our art, seen through a slightly different lens. It looks like something that has no name in our vocabulary because the vocabulary to describe it does not exist in our timeline. Language, too, would have been different. We have established that Neanderthals almost certainly had the biological equipment for complex speech. In our alternate timeline, with interbreeding producing bilingual households, or perhaps more accurately, bidialectal households, where the two parents' ways of speaking shared deep structural similarities, but diverged in their vocabulary or the specific textures of their different relationships to the world. The languages that emerge from centuries of contact are contact languages, creoles, tongues that carry the grammatical logic of one tradition and the ecological vocabulary of another. The words for snow, for the particular quality of light on limestone in winter, for the sound that a mammoth makes when it is frightened. These come from the Neanderthal side of the house. The words for tomorrow, for because, for the conceptual structures of hypothetical and contingent thought. These may come from the modern human side. The result is a language, or a family of languages, that can do things that neither parent tongue could do alone. 20,000 years ago, in our actual timeline, the last glacial maximum held the northern hemisphere in its grip. Ice sheets 2 miles thick buried what is now Scandinavia, Britain, and northern Germany. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today because so much of the planet's water was locked in ice. The Sahara was not the desert we know, but a cold, dry, largely uninhabitable steppe. The world's human population had contracted dramatically, pushed south and into refugia, sheltered pockets where the climate remained survivable, and the total number of humans alive on Earth may have been as few as 10,000 individuals. In our alternate timeline, this same climatic catastrophe falls on a population that includes both modern humans and Neanderthals. The Neanderthals have a crucial advantage here. They have survived glacial maxima before. Their lineage has persisted through multiple ice ages, each one a hammer blow to the ecology of Europe, and they carry in their bodies and their cultural memory the specific adaptations that make survival possible. Their broader cold weather physiology, the heat-retaining proportions, the respiratory architecture, confers genuine advantage in a world where the temperature in what is now Paris might drop 40 degrees below zero in a bad winter. Their knowledge of which plants remain available under snow, which animals can be hunted even when the megafauna have migrated south, which cave systems provide the most reliable insulation. This knowledge is not in books. It lives in minds, passed from parent to child, across thousands of years of ordinary, terrible winters. The effect of the last glacial maximum on the alternate timeline's mixed population is paradoxically to accelerate integration. When the refugia shrink, when there are only a handful of viable places in southern Europe and the Levant where enough food exists to sustain a community, the groups that survive are those that can pool knowledge across lineages. A modern human community with strong social networks and long-range trade capacity, combined with a Neanderthal community with deep local ecological knowledge and cold weather physiology, is more likely to make it through a glacial maximum than either community alone. The ice does not discriminate between lineages. It only selects for survival, and survival at the extreme edge of habitability belongs to the groups that can most efficiently extract energy from an impoverished environment. The tools change too. The Neanderthal tool-making tradition, the Mousterian with its prepared core technique, its ability to produce large numbers of usable flakes from a single carefully shaped stone, had been stable for 200,000 years. In our actual history, it gives way to the more elaborate traditions of the Upper Paleolithic without any evidence of meaningful exchange. The Mousterian simply ends, and the new traditions begin as if a page had been turned. In our alternate timeline, the two traditions meet and interpenetrate. The Mousterian's efficiency at producing working tools from difficult stone, a skill honed over 200 millennia of practice, combines with the modern human tradition's capacity for hafting, for composite tools, for the invention of entirely new tool categories. The result is a technological tradition that advances faster than either did alone, because it can draw on two deep wells of accumulated technique. By 15,000 years ago in our alternate timeline, the ice is beginning to retreat as it did in our actual history. But the world it uncovers is populated differently. The modern human populations of southern Europe and the Levant have spent 5,000 years of glacial maximum in close proximity to Neanderthal remnant populations, and the demographic and cultural fusion has proceeded further than anything that occurred in our timeline. The groups that expand north as the ice retreats are carrying Neanderthal genes in concentrations that might reach 10, 15, perhaps 20% of their total genome, not the 1 to 4% that non-Africans carry today, but a substantial and phenotypically significant fraction. These are people who look different from the modern humans of our timeline. They are, in some measurable ways, built differently. think differently, process the world differently. They are carrying something ancient and specifically European into the opening world of the Holocene. And they are not alone. In the deep valleys of the Pyrenees, in the Cantabrian mountains of northern Spain, in the karst limestone country of what is now Croatia and Slovenia, there are still communities that would be identifiable as Neanderthal dominant. Groups in which the archaic features predominate, in which the tool-making traditions and the ecological knowledge and the physical adaptations of 400,000 years of European residence are still the primary heritage. They are no longer isolated. They trade with the modern human communities of the lowlands. They intermarry occasionally. They speak languages that share vocabulary with the lowland tongues, but they are distinct, and they know they are distinct. And in the cold, clear air of the mountain valleys, they are practicing a way of being human that is not quite like anything our actual timeline produced. In our actual timeline, the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunter-gatherer economies to settled agriculture, began in the Fertile Crescent of the Levant, approximately 12,000 years ago, and spread across Europe over the following several thousand years. It was not a simple triumph of a better technology over a worse one. It was a slow, complex, regionally variable process that involved a great deal of hardship. The skeletons of early agricultural populations show clear signs of nutritional deficiency compared to their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Early farmers were shorter, had more tooth decay, and suffered from a wider range of infectious diseases than the hunter-gatherers they were displacing or replacing. Agriculture was not at first a good deal for most of the people who adopted it. It was a deal that made a certain kind of population growth possible, and population growth, once begun, tends to be self-sustaining in ways that individual welfare cannot resist. In our alternate timeline, the Neolithic Revolution still occurs. Its drivers are climatic and demographic, rooted in the specific conditions of the early Holocene, and those conditions are not substantially different from our actual history. But the way it unfolds across Europe is different, because the population it is spreading through is different. The modern human agricultural communities pushing out of the Levant and Anatolia encounter as they move into Europe, not the hunter-gatherer populations of our timeline's late Mesolithic, but a more complex situation. Hybrid communities with a deep Neanderthal heritage, and in the mountain redoubts, still distinct Neanderthal-dominant groups whose relationship to the landscape is so profound and so long established that the agricultural model simply does not apply to them in the same way. The Neanderthal side of the human inheritance is, in certain specific and important ways, resistant to the agricultural logic. This is not a question of intelligence or adaptability. It is a question of a 400,000-year heritage of a particular relationship to the land. Neanderthals were obligate hunters and foragers in a cold climate, megafauna-rich environment. Their bodies were shaped by this ecology, the high-protein, high-fat diet of a successful hunter leaves marks on teeth and bones that are clearly legible in the fossil record. And so, presumably, were their cultural habits, their cognitive orientations, their relationships to time and planning and the future. the deep future, the season after next, the year after that. These are the time horizons of the agriculturalist, the immediate future. Where is the herd today? Where will it be tomorrow? What does the sky tell me about the next 3 days? Is the time horizon of the hunter. These are different cognitive orientations, and they shape different cultures and different economies. What this means for our alternate timeline is that the spread of agriculture across Europe is not the relatively clean replacement process that the genetic evidence of our actual history suggests, a process in which incoming Anatolian farmers largely displaced or absorbed the existing hunter-gatherer populations, leaving only a small residual genetic signal. In our alternate timeline, the Neanderthal heritage communities of Europe are more resistant to replacement, not through violence primarily, but through the persistence of an economic model that remains viable in certain ecologies for much longer. The mountain communities, the Neanderthal dominant groups of the Pyrenees, the Alps, the Carpathians, the Caucasus, are practicing a form of mixed economy that combines sophisticated hunting and foraging with small-scale animal husbandry and selective cultivation of high-value plants. They are not purely hunter-gatherers, but they are not farmers either. They are something in between, something that has no clear analog in our actual history, and they are practicing it with the deep ecological knowledge of a lineage that has been reading this particular landscape for 400,000 years. The agricultural communities of the lowlands need what the mountain communities have: the Neanderthal heritage knowledge of cold season survival, of animal behavior, of the specific plants that remain nutritious and available in the worst winters. The mountain communities need what the lowland farmers can provide: grain surpluses that buffer against the catastrophic hunting failures that periodically devastate hunter-gatherer economies, metal tools, and the social complexity that comes with settled, dense populations. The trade that develops between these communities is not simply an exchange of goods. It is an exchange of cognitive and cultural models, and it produces in the lowland communities an agricultural practice that is more ecologically sophisticated, more attuned to the long-term health of the land, and less prone to the catastrophic soil depletion and deforestation that would eventually undermine the agricultural civilizations of our actual history. This is not utopian speculation. It is an inference from what we know about the ecological knowledge encoded in Neanderthal heritage adaptation. A farming culture that has been shaped by 400,000 years of reading a landscape's signals is a farming culture that knows, at a deeply intuitive level, what the land can bear and what it cannot. The distinction between use and destruction is not always obvious to a mind that has been in a landscape for only a few hundred years. It is very obvious to a mind whose ancestors have been in that same landscape for 400,000. The alternate histories Europe, shaped by this combination, does not exhaust its soils in the same way or at the same pace. The consequences of this difference, compounded across 10,000 years, are enormous. Let us advance the clock. Let us move to 5,000 years ago, to the period that in our actual timeline corresponds to the early Bronze Age, the rise of the first cities in Mesopotamia, the beginning of the first writing systems, the construction of the megalithic monuments of Western Europe. In our alternate timeline, the world at this point is recognizable in its broad outlines, but deeply strange in its specifics. There are cities, there is trade, there is metallurgy, there is somewhere the beginning of writing, but the map of where these things have developed and what they look like and what kind of human societies are practicing them is not the map of our actual early civilizations. The most significant divergence is in Europe itself. In our actual history, Europe in the early Bronze Age is a continent of scattered farming communities, tribal hierarchies, and long-distance trade networks, impressive in their scope, but not yet producing the dense urban concentrations that we would call civilization. The reasons for this are partly geographic. Europe's complex coastline and river systems favor trade over centralization, and partly demographic. European populations of the period are recovering from the disruptions of the Neolithic transition. The great civilizations of the ancient world arise first in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where the combination of reliable flood irrigation agriculture, navigable rivers, and large flat plains creates the conditions for the population density that cities require. In our alternate timeline, Europe's development is not dramatically ahead of our actual history's timeline. The basic material constraints of geography and climate still apply, but it is different in character. The Neanderthal heritage mountain communities of the Alps and Carpathians have been practicing metalworking for longer, driven by their deep familiarity with the geological signatures of metal-bearing rock, a familiarity born of 400,000 years of stone tool-making, of reading the landscape for usable materials. The copper deposits of the Alps were discovered and exploited in our actual timeline as well. The Iceman, Otzi, who died in the Alps approximately 5,300 years ago, carried a copper axe, but in our alternate timeline, the exploitation is deeper and earlier, because the communities doing the exploiting have a more sophisticated relationship with the mountain geology. The trade networks that move this metal across Europe are managed, in part, by the hybrid communities of the upland valleys, communities that have, by 5,000 years ago, developed a kind of ecological broker role, serving as intermediaries between the lowland agricultural civilizations and the remaining Neanderthal heritage communities of the high mountains. These communities are not powerful in the way that the early city-states of Mesopotamia are powerful. They do not command armies or extract tribute from vast agricultural hinterlands, but they control something that is, in the long run, equally valuable. They control access to the mountain passes, to the metal deposits, to the deep ecological knowledge that makes sustained agriculture in difficult environments possible. They are, in the language of later economic history, a rentier class, but a rentier class whose rents are paid in ecological services and specialist knowledge rather than in land alone. The cities that develop in this alternate Europe are consequently differently organized than the cities of our actual Bronze Age Mediterranean. They are less monumental, less hierarchical, less focused on the extraction and accumulation of surplus by a small ruling elite. They are more federated, more networked, more attentive to the ecological constraints of their hinterlands, because those hinterlands are populated by communities that know how to make those constraints legible and insist that they be respected. This is not because the people of this alternate timeline are morally superior to the people of our actual history. It is because the knowledge structures that flow through the society from the Neanderthal heritage communities impose a kind of ecological discipline that the purely modern human societies of our actual history did not have available to them. The information was not there. In the alternate timeline, it is. The writing systems that develop in this alternate world are inevitably shaped by these different social structures. In our actual history, writing arises first as an accounting technology, a way to track the grain stores and the livestock and the labor obligations of a complex, hierarchical, redistributive economy. In our alternate timeline, with its more federated, ecologically sophisticated social structures, writing arises somewhat later and for somewhat different reasons, less as an accounting tool and more as a medium for the encoding and transmission of ecological knowledge, the long memories of landscape and season and animal behavior that the Neanderthal heritage has always carried in oral tradition. The first texts of this alternate civilization are not grain inventories, they are field guides. One of the most difficult things to model in any alternate history is the persistence of biological difference over long time spans. In our actual timeline, the genetic diversity of living humans is remarkably low, lower than that of chimpanzees, lower than that of many other large mammal species, largely because of the bottlenecks that our lineage passed through during the dispersal out of Africa and the subsequent founder effects of expanding into new territories. We are genetically a very young species, and we carry the demographic scars of that youth in our DNA. In our alternate timeline, with a second hominid lineage contributing its genetic heritage to the expanding human population, the total genetic diversity of humanity is higher. Not enormously higher. Neanderthals were themselves not an especially diverse population by the time of the overlap with modern humans, having passed through their own bottlenecks during the ice ages, but meaningfully higher in ways that have population-level consequences for disease resistance, for the range of cognitive variation, for the distribution of physical traits across the landscape. The Neanderthal genome contributes immune genes that are particularly effective against certain European and Western Asian pathogens. In our actual timeline, these genes are present in the 1 to 4% of Neanderthal ancestry that non-African humans carry. They have been identified in the HLA immune system and elsewhere, and their presence in our actual genome is thought to have provided genuine protective advantage. In our alternate timeline, where Neanderthal ancestry in European populations might be 10 to 20% rather than 1 to 4, this advantage is substantially larger. This matters most at the beginning of the great pandemic eras. In our actual history, the development of agriculture and dense urban populations creates the conditions for the epidemic infectious diseases that would devastate human populations repeatedly over the following millennia. The Great Plagues, the smallpox outbreaks, the waves of influenza that would periodically flatten entire communities. In our alternate timeline, the higher frequency of Neanderthal-derived immune variants in the European population does not prevent these diseases. The agricultural revolution creates the same population densities and the same animal-human interfaces that generate novel pathogens, regardless of the genetic heritage of the host population. But it may dampen their impact. A population with a wider range of immune variation is more resistant to any single pathogen. The same pandemic that kills 30% of a genetically uniform population may kill 20% of a more diverse one. But biological difference is not only about immunity. By 5,000 years ago in our alternate timeline, the population of Europe presents a visible range of physical variation that is greater than anything in our actual history's European gene pool of the same period. In the mountain communities where Neanderthal ancestry is most concentrated, individuals carried the classic archaic features in reduced but recognizable form. The heavy brow ridge, softened but present, the wider nasal passage, the broader chest, the somewhat shorter and more massively built limb proportions. These are not the comic book Neanderthals of early popular imagination, knuckle-dragging, slack-jawed, barely upright. They are fully modern-looking people by any functional definition, but they carry in their faces and bodies a visible record of a different ancestry that the lowland communities with their lower Neanderthal admixture do not. How these visible differences are interpreted culturally is one of the most important and most unpredictable questions in the alternate history. Human societies have a profound tendency to construct meaning from physical difference, to read biological variation as an indicator of cultural or intellectual difference, to build hierarchies on the basis of appearance. This tendency is not eliminated in our alternate timeline. The mountain communities with their archaic features may be subjected to prejudice by the lowland populations, or they may be idealized, the ancient, the deep, the ones who were there before, or some complex mixture of both, shifting with political circumstance. The alternate history does not guarantee a better moral universe. It guarantees only a different physical and cultural landscape in which the same human tendencies play out in different configurations. What it does offer, and this is not nothing, is a world in which the visible evidence of deep time is written on the faces of the living. In our actual timeline, the deep past is accessible only through fossils and DNA. It is invisible in the human faces around us. In the alternate timeline, someone in a marketplace, in what might correspond to Neolithic Switzerland, could look across the square and see, in an older man's brow ridge, in a woman's broader nasal arch, the ghost of 400,000 years of European winter. The deep past would not be in museums. It would be in faces. It would be in the way a person's hands moved when they were working a stone, in the specific angle of a gaze reading a hillside for the signs of game. History would be embodied, not archived, and that would change everything about how people thought, about time, about ancestry, about who they were and where they came from. Philosophy, as we have practiced it in our actual timeline, is in part a product of estrangement. The ancient Greek philosophers who laid the foundations of Western thought were grappling, among other things, with the shock of encountering radically different cultures, the Persians, the Egyptians, the peoples of the wider Mediterranean world, and recognizing that the assumptions embedded in their own culture were not universal. This encounter with difference generates a particular kind of reflective thinking. If they believe X and we believe Y, and neither of us is obviously wrong, then what are beliefs, and how do we know which ones are true? The shock of cultural difference is one of the engines of philosophical reflection. In our alternate timeline, this engine runs differently, and earlier, and with more fuel. The coexistence of modern human and Neanderthal heritage communities across Europe for 50,000 years, in various configurations of contact and separation and integration, generates a sustained encounter with cognitive and cultural difference that has no parallel in our actual history. The philosophical and spiritual traditions that emerge from this encounter are shaped by a question that our actual history's thinkers only approached obliquely. What is it to be human, when there is more than one way to be human? This is not an abstract question in the alternate timeline. It is a practical one, faced every generation by communities living at the boundaries of the two heritages. The religious traditions of this alternate world carry the marks of this question throughout. The great recurring themes of our actual world's religions, the relationship between the human and the divine, the problem of death, the basis of moral obligation, are present in the alternate timeline's traditions as well. But they are accompanied by a theme that has no strong equivalent in our actual world's mainstream traditions. The question of what we owe to those who are different from us in kind, not merely in degree. The Neanderthal heritage communities have a different relationship to time, to the dead, to the land, to the non-human world, and these differences have been generating theological and philosophical problems in the alternate timelines cultures for as long as those cultures have existed. The environmental philosophy of the alternate world is consequently not a modern invention, as it largely is in our actual timeline. It is not something that had to be constructed from scratch in the 20th century in response to the catastrophic evidence of industrial despoliation. It is an ancient tradition rooted in the Neanderthal heritage's 400,000-year relationship with the European landscape, encoded in the ecological knowledge of the mountain communities, and transmitted imperfectly, partially, with the inevitable distortions of translation across lineages and centuries into the mainstream cultures of the lowland civilizations. The question of what the land can bear is not, in this alternate world, a new question. It is one of the oldest questions. It has institutions and rituals and texts devoted to it. It has professionals, people whose role in the community is to remember and transmit the ecological knowledge of the deep past, in the way that our actual world has priests and lawyers and doctors. Science, when it develops in this alternate world, develops in conversation with this tradition. The scientific revolution of our actual history emerged partly from a break with tradition. The deliberate, sometimes violent rejection of inherited authority in favor of systematic observation and experiment. In the alternate world, the inherited tradition includes a body of systematic ecological knowledge that is, in some respects, a form of empirical science already, a set of generalizations about the behavior of living systems derived from centuries of careful observation and tested against the consequences of acting on them. The scientists of the alternate world's early modern period are not breaking with a purely dogmatic tradition. They are building on an empirical one, and the shape of the science they build is consequently different, more ecological, more systemic, less focused on the extraction and manipulation of nature, and more focused on the understanding of it. This is not to say that the alternate world avoids the mistakes of our own. The alternate history is not a utopia. It is a world populated by the same mix of brilliance and violence, generosity and greed, long-term wisdom and catastrophic short-term thinking that characterizes our actual human record. The ecological knowledge of the Neanderthal heritage is not sufficient by itself to prevent the overexploitation of resources, the collapse of fisheries, the deforestation of watersheds. It slows these processes. It generates more resistance to them. It produces cultures in which the voices warning against overexploitation are not marginal but central. But it does not eliminate them. History, in any timeline, is a tragedy partially interrupted by wisdom. There is a melancholy version of this alternate history that deserves to be spoken plainly, because it is not speculative. It is, in a sense, already true. In our actual timeline, we lost something at the end of the Pleistocene, and we have been living with that loss ever since, without fully knowing what it was that we lost. The Neanderthals are gone, not entirely, because their genes are in us, but gone as a lived tradition, a living presence, a living way of being in the world. Whatever they knew, whatever specific understanding of the European landscape 400,000 years had produced in them, died with the last individual who carried that knowledge as a living practice rather than a residue in someone else's DNA. We catch glimpses of what it might have been. The extraordinary ecological knowledge of indigenous hunter-gatherer communities in our actual world gives a sense of the depth of understanding that sustained, place-based human experience can generate. The Aboriginal Australians have been in their landscape for 60,000 years, and the ecological knowledge encoded in their culture, in their land management practices, their fire regimes, their understanding of species distributions and seasonal patterns across an entire continent, so sophisticated that Western science has spent the better part of a century catching up to it. This is 60,000 years of observation. Neanderthals spent 400,000 years in theirs. The loss is not only ecological, it is cognitive, it is aesthetic, it is philosophical. A mind shaped by 400,000 years of European winter, of reading the landscape for survival, of living in small, intensely bonded communities in the shadow of the ice. This mind would have approached the world differently than ours does. Not better, necessarily. Not worse, but differently. It would have had different intuitions about the relationships between things, different emotional responses to landscape and weather, and the movements of animals, different ways of making sense of the ordinary and the extraordinary. We have, in our actual timeline, only the faintest echo of this difference in the 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA that flows through the bodies of non-African humanity. It is there, doing quiet work in our immune systems and our facial structures, and perhaps in cognitive capacities we cannot yet measure. But the tradition that would have made it legible, the culture, the language, the practice, is gone. The alternate history is, in this sense, a thought experiment about completeness. What would it mean to be a humanity that had not lost one of its founding lineages? What would it mean to carry that tradition forward, not as a genetic residue, but as a living cultural presence? The answer, across all the acts of this narrative, is that it would mean a world that read itself differently, that had different intuitions about time, about land, about the relationship between the human and the non-human, about what knowledge is and how it is transmitted and what it is for. It would not mean a world without conflict or suffering or catastrophe. It would mean a world with different resources for confronting those things. And those resources, compounded over 50,000 years, would have produced a civilization of a different character than the one we actually have. What character exactly is something no one can say with confidence, because the alternate history is genuinely contingent. It depends on an enormous number of local decisions, ecological accidents, epidemiological events, and random variations in the births and deaths of key individuals that no model can fully specify. The broad outlines are tractable: more ecological sophistication, more cognitive diversity, more philosophical engagement with the question of what it means to be human. The details are not. The specific scientists and artists and political leaders of the alternate world are not predictable. The specific discoveries, the specific wars, the specific catastrophes and recoveries, these are not written in the premise. They emerge from a process that is irreducibly complex, and that is the honest end of the counterfactual. What the alternate history reveals, ultimately, is something about our own. It reveals, by contrast, the specific shape of what we are, a species that survived a bottleneck, that won a competition, that absorbed a rival lineage without fully understanding what it was absorbing, and then spread across the planet, carrying its particular cognitive and cultural heritage with a thoroughness that left no room for alternatives. We are a monoculture in a sense that has no precise biological meaning, but a real conceptual one. We are a single answer to the question of what it means to be a large-brained, language-using, socially complex primate. The alternate history asks what it would look like to have two answers to that question living in the same world. The fact that we can ask this question at all, that we have the Neanderthal genome to read, the archaeology to interpret, the evolutionary biology to reason with, is perhaps the most consoling thing about our actual situation. We cannot undo the loss, but we can know that it was a loss. We can hold the ghost of the other answer in our minds and let it change the way we look at ourselves. We began 40,000 years ago beside a river in southern France with two kinds of smoke rising from two separate fires. We have traveled a long way from that river. We have imagined the cities and the philosophies and the ecologies of a world that never was, and in doing so, we have circled again and again back to the same question: what are we, and what might we have been? These are not comfortable questions. They are the questions that deep time always asks, when you spend long enough inside it. Here is what we actually know, as opposed to what we have imagined. The Neanderthal genome has been sequenced, the work of Svante Pääbo and his colleagues, for which Pääbo received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, is one of the great scientific achievements of our time. We know that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred on multiple occasions, in multiple locations, across a span of tens of thousands of years. We know that the genetic legacy of those encounters is still in us, still doing biological work, still shaping our immune responses and possibly aspects of our physiology and cognition in ways that we are only beginning to understand. We know that the Neanderthals were not the primitive brutes of Victorian imagination, but fully capable, culturally sophisticated beings with the biological equipment for complex speech, the demonstrated capacity for symbolic behavior, the emotional depth to care for their injured and grieve their dead. What we do not know, what we will probably never know with certainty, is what it felt like to be one of them. The phenomenology of a Neanderthal mind, the specific texture of its inner experience, the particular way it processed the extraordinary fact of being alive in a cold and beautiful and dangerous world. This is permanently beyond our reach. We can reconstruct the skull. We can sequence the genome. We can analyze the isotopes of their teeth to know what they ate in which seasons. We can find the ochre they ground, and the eagle talons they wore, and the flowers, perhaps, they placed on their dead. But we cannot know what they dreamed. We cannot know what they feared in the dark. We cannot know what they felt when they looked up on a clear night on a limestone ridge in what is now Croatia or Spain or Germany, and saw the same stars we see now, burning in the same patterns with no names yet to give them. The alternate history is, at its deepest level, an act of mourning. It is a way of acknowledging that something real was lost, not in the abstract, not philosophically, but biologically and culturally and cognitively real, when the last communities that carried the Neanderthal tradition as a living practice disappeared from the world. The loss is not recoverable. The tradition is gone. But the genes are not gone, and this is strange and consoling in equal measure. The Neanderthals are not entirely absent from the world. They are in us. They are in the 1 to 4% of every non-African human genome, doing quiet work that we are only beginning to read. When Svante Pääbo and his team sequenced the first Neanderthal genome from a fragment of finger bone recovered from the Denisova cave in Siberia, they were not just reading ancient DNA. They were listening to a voice that had been silent for 40,000 years. The voice was saying, "I was here. I was real. My life had weight and duration and consequence. And some part of me is still here, in you, in the cells of your immune system, in the structure of your face, in whatever small but real ways my 400,000 years of living shaped the children who carried both of us forward into the future." The earth does not mourn its lost lineages. It is indifferent to them, as it is indifferent to everything, to us, to our civilizations, to the extraordinary fact that any of this happened at all. The Neanderthal caves are still there, in the limestone of Europe, still holding the chemical signatures of the fires that burned in them, still offering up fragments of bone and ochre and worked stone to the paleontologists who come with their brushes and their sampling tubes. The land does not know that the people who made those fires are gone. The land does not know anything, but we do. We have the extraordinary privilege and the extraordinary burden of being the kind of creature that can look back across 40,000 years and ask what happened and why and what we lost and what we kept. We are the ones who remember. We are the ones for whom the alternate history is possible, not because it happened, but because we are strange and sad and brilliant enough to imagine that it might have. The river in southern France is still there. The hills above it still hold the same curve, still catch the same afternoon light. The caves where both kinds of fire once burned have been dark for a very long time. But the smoke from those fires, in a sense that is not quite metaphor and not quite science, is still in us. We breathe it out every time we ask who we are and where we came from, and what the world might have been if the story had gone differently. We are asking those questions right now, together in the dark. And that, perhaps, is the most Neanderthal thing about us. The insistence on sitting with the dead and wondering and not turning away.